Pawn e2 to e4. Pawn e7 to e5. Pawn f2 to f4. Pawn d7 to d5. Pawn e4 takes d5. Pawn e5 to e4. Pawn d2 to d3. Knight g8 to f6. Pawn d3 takes e4. Knight f6 takes e4. Knight b1 to c3. Bishop f8 to b4. Bishop f1 to b5, check. Pawn c7 to c6. Bishop b5 takes c6, check. Pawn b7 takes c6. Pawn d5 takes c6. Bishop b4 takes c3, check. Pawn b2 takes c3. Queen d8 takes d1, check. King e1 takes d1. Knight e4 to f2, check. King d1 to e1. Knight f2 takes h1. Pawn c6 to c7. Knight b8 to a6. Knight g1 to f3. Castle kingside. Bishop c1 to a3. Rook f8 to e8, check. King e1 to d2. Knight h1 to f2. Bishop a3 to d6. Knight f2 to e4, check. King d2 to e1. Knight e4 takes d6, check. Knight f3 to e5. Pawn f7 to f6. Rook a1 to d1. Knight d6 to c4. Rook d1 to d8. Knight a6 takes c7. Rook d8 takes e8, check. Knight c7 takes e8. Knight e5 takes c4. Bishop c8 to e6. Knight c4 to e3. Rook a8 to c8. Pawn c3 to c4. Knight e8 to d6. Pawn f4 to f5. Knight d6 takes f5. King e1 to d2. Rook c8 to d8, check. King d2 to e2. Knight f5 takes e3. King e2 takes e3. Bishop e6 takes c4. Pawn a2 to a4. Bishop c4 to d5. Pawn g2 to g4. King g8 to f7. Pawn c2 to c3. King f7 to e6. Pawn h2 to h4. Pawn f6 to f5. Pawn g4 takes f5, check. King e6 to e5. Pawn a4 to a5. Rook d8 to f8. Pawn h4 to h5. Rook f8 takes f5. Pawn c3 to c4. Bishop d5 takes c4. Pawn h5 to h6. Pawn g7 takes h6. King e3 to d2. King e5 to d4. Pawn a5 to a6. Rook f5 to f2, check. King d2 to e1. Rook f2 to c2. King e1 to d1. Pawn h6 to h5. King d1 to e1. Pawn h5 to h4. King e1 to d1. Rook c2 to e2. King d1 to c1. Pawn h4 to h3. King c1 to d1. Pawn h3 to h2. King d1 to c1. Pawn h2 to h1, promoting to queen, checkmate.